The bus started moving, its engine emitting a low hum that echoed off the concrete walls of the bus station. The interior smelled like a mixture of cheap disinfectant, sweat, and old seat upholstery. The passengers sat down in their seats, someone was looking out of the cloudy windows, someone was staring at the phone, and someone just closed their eyes, hoping to sleep through the long journey. The driver, an elderly man with greasy hair and tired eyes, made a short announcement through the speaker: "Keep your bags with you, there are few stops, the toilet is at the end of the cabin." His voice was hoarse, as if he had smoked a pack of cigarettes before his shift. No one paid much attention to him, a common routine for those who are used to such trips. Among the passengers was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a battered bag on her lap. She fiddled with the strap nervously, glancing at the others. Next to her sat a teenager in a hoodie, with headphones dangling from his neck, and a blank stare fixed somewhere on the floor. Further down the aisle, a man in a work jacket, with rough hands covered with calluses and small scars, obviously some kind of construction worker or mechanic, settled down. There was a couple in the back seats, a young girl with bright red hair and her boyfriend, who kept whispering something in her ear, causing quiet laughter. They were all strangers to each other, united only by the ticket for this flight. It was going to be a long road. The bus traveled on an intercity route, winding through rural areas where fields gave way to sparse gas stations and abandoned barns. The sun was already setting, flooding the interior with a dim orange glow. The woman with the bag took out a bottle of water, took a sip and hid it again, as if she was afraid that someone would notice. Her movements were jerky, and her eyes darted around. She did not know that at that moment another passenger was watching her, a tall, thin man in a gray coat, who was sitting closer to the middle of the cabin. There was a leather folder on his lap, which he stroked from time to time, as if calming himself. During the first hours of the trip, nothing unusual happened. The driver was silent, the radio was hissing softly with some old tune, and the passengers were lost in thought. But then the bus shook slightly, the wheel got into a pothole on the road. Several people looked up, but quickly returned to their work. Only the woman with the bag tensed up more, her fingers squeezed the strap until her knuckles turned white. She knew something the others didn't. Or she was afraid of what might happen. A little later, when dusk had gathered outside the windows, a teenager in a hoodie got up and went to the toilet at the end of the salon. As he passed by, he accidentally elbowed a woman's bag. She jerked violently, almost dropping it, and shot the guy a look full of suspicion. "I'm sorry," he muttered, not even turning around. She didn't answer, just hugged the bag closer to her. At that moment, the man in the gray coat leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowed, as if he was trying to see what exactly she was guarding. Meanwhile, the driver turned onto a narrow road surrounded by dense forest. The headlights picked out the bare branches of trees from the darkness, which seemed like clawed hands reaching for the bus. One of the passengers, an elderly man with a cane, muttered something about this being the wrong route, but no one heard him. The driver turned on the high beam, and the beam illuminated a rusty signpost, half hidden by bushes. The inscription on it had been erased by time, but the direction pointed somewhere deep into the forest. The bus slowed down, and the first anxious whisper was heard in the cabin. The girl with red hair turned to her boyfriend. "Is this okay? Where are we even?" He shrugged his shoulders, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "It's probably some kind of detour." However, the tension began to grow. A man in a work jacket got up and approached the driver, tapping on the partition. "Hey, buddy, where are we going? This is not the right road." The driver didn't answer, just tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His face looked strange in the rearview mirror, his lips were pursed up, and his eyes glittered like a man who was hiding something. A few minutes later, the bus stopped. Not at a gas station, not at the curb, just in the middle of a forest road. The engine stalled, and silence fell, broken only by the creaking of seats and the rustle of clothes. The driver slowly turned to the passengers, his voice lower and sharper now, a small breakdown. "I'll figure it out now." He took the flashlight from under the seat and went out, leaving the door open. Cold air rushed into the cabin, bringing with it the smell of dampness and pine needles. The woman with the bag shifted in place, her breathing became ragged. The teenager returned from the toilet and sat down, glancing at the open door. What the hell? Did he leave us here or something? The man in the gray coat was silent, but his fingers tightened on the folder. And then there was a sound, not the driver's footsteps, but something else. The crunching of branches, heavy breathing, as if someone or something was moving in the forest nearby. The passengers exchanged glances, and at that moment it became clear, this trip will not be an ordinary one. The crunching of branches grew louder, and several passengers involuntarily leaned towards the windows, trying to see at least something in the darkness outside the bus. The headlights illuminated only a narrow strip of road ahead, and everything else was lost in the blackness of the forest. The woman with the bag pressed herself into the seat, her lips moving as if she were whispering a prayer, although no one heard the words. The man in the work jacket knocked on the driver's partition again. Hey, where is that damn driver? Did he leave? There was no answer, only silence, broken by the sounds outside. The red-haired girl stood up, her boyfriend grabbed her arm. Sit down, don't get in there. But she pulled her hand away and stepped towards the open exit, shouting into the darkness. Hey, driver. Where are you? Her voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. Instead, a new sound came from the forest, a low, prolonged creaking, as if someone was slowly dragging something heavy along the ground. The girl froze, her face paled, and she quickly returned to her seat, clinging to the guy. The man in the gray coat finally spoke, his voice calm but steely. We need to check what's going on. Sitting here and waiting is not an option. He stood up, carefully placing the folder on the seat, and took out a small folding knife from his pocket. The teenager in the hoodie chuckled. Seriously, dude? Are you going to the forest with this knife? The man didn't answer, just gave the guy a cold look and took a step towards the exit. Meanwhile, the woman with the bag began rummaging through it. Her movements became even more convulsive. She pulled out an old cell phone with a cracked screen and tried to dial a number, but there was no signal. Damn, she muttered, throwing the phone back. An elderly man with a cane, who was sitting closer to the back seats, coughed and said, I said that this is not the right road. He brought us here on purpose. His words hung in the air, and several people turned to him, waiting for him to continue. But the old man just shook his head and fell silent. The man in the work jacket couldn't stand it. Let's go out and find this freak. How long can I sit? He grabbed a tire iron that was lying by the driver's seat and jumped to the ground first. He was followed by a man in a gray coat, and then, after a moment's hesitation, a teenager in a hoodie. I'm not staying here alone with these lunatics, he muttered, pulling up his hood. The rest of the passengers remained in the cabin, but the tension was growing by the second. The forest seemed even denser from the outside than from the windows. The driver's light lay on the ground by the front wheel, still shining, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. A man in a work jacket picked up a flashlight and shone it around. The beam picked out footprints from the darkness, deep boot prints leading towards the trees. But there were other footprints next to them, less clear, as if someone had dragged their feet or something heavy. What kind of shit is this? He cursed, tightening his grip on the tire iron. The trio followed the tracks, trying not to make any noise. The teenager was constantly looking around, his breathing was fast and uneven. A few meters later, they came across the driver's backpack, abandoned at the roots of a huge tree. The lock was undone, and there were some papers and a plastic bag with something red and sticky inside. The man in the gray coat crouched down, carefully parted the contents with the tip of a knife, and froze. It's blood, he said softly. The teenager backed away. Are you kidding? Is this real blood? Before anyone could answer, a scream rang out from the depths of the forest. Not human, but some kind of animal, sharp and full of pain. The man in the work jacket swore and picked up the tire iron. Whoever it is, I'll smash his head in. They moved on, although the teenager clearly wanted to return. The tracks led to a small clearing where the grass was flattened, and in the center was a piece of cloth, a piece of the driver's uniform jacket soaked in something dark. At that moment, the bus started to panic. The woman with the bags suddenly jumped up and screamed, "We're all going to die here. You don't understand what he did." The red-haired girl tried to calm her down, but she broke away and rushed to the exit, almost knocking down the old man with a cane. Her bag fell, and things fell out of it: clothes, a wad of money wrapped in cellophane, and several photos. One of them showed a bus driver standing next to a man in a military uniform. They were both smiling, but the background was blurred, just a field and a piece of fence. The red-haired girl's boyfriend picked up the photo and frowned. "Is that our driver? Who is this woman anyway?" The woman had already run outside, her screams fading into the forest. The old man with the cane slowly stood up. "She knows more than she's letting on." He nodded at the empty driver's seat, and there was dead silence in the cabin. Meanwhile, the group outside came across something even more terrifying. Beyond the clearing, a ravine began, and below, in the light of a lantern, they saw a body. It was the driver, or what was left of him. His chest was torn open, as if someone had grabbed his ribs and twisted them out. His face was frozen in a grimace of horror, his eyes wide open, and his mouth twisted in a silent scream. The teenager turned away and immediately vomited, falling to his knees. The man in the work jacket exhaled. It wasn't an animal that did this. The man in the gray coat silently examined the body, then noticed something to the side, a metallic sheen. He walked over and picked up a rusty hook tied to a piece of rope, stained with blood. "It's not an accident," he finally said. "Someone is hunting. And not just at him." At that moment, new sounds were heard from the forest, footsteps, heavy and confident, approaching the clearing. The man in the work jacket turned around, holding the tire iron in front of him. "Come out, you beast, I'm not afraid of you." But what came out from behind the trees silenced him. It was a man, tall, in shabby clothes, with his face hidden under a dirty cloth tied around his head. In his hands he held a long metal rod, the end of which was bent into a rough hook. There was a trail of blood behind him, and pieces of what looked like human skin hung from his belt. The teenager screamed and started to run, but tripped over a root and fell to the ground. A man in a gray coat stepped forward, raising a knife. "Who are you?" The stranger didn't answer, just tilted his head as if listening. On the bus, the panic reached its peak. The woman with the bag returned. Her clothes were torn, and her hands were covered with dirt and blood. She stumbled into the salon, panting, "He's coming. He's coming for us." The red-haired girl screamed. Her boyfriend tried to barricade the door with bags, but it was useless. The old man with the cane stood up and slowly walked towards the exit. "It's useless to run. He knows where we are." His calmness only increased the terror of the others. A hoarse scream rang out from outside. It was the voice of a teenager. Then there was silence, interrupted only by the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer to the bus. The lamp by the wheel went out, and the interior was plunged into darkness. The woman with the bag fell to her knees, whispering, "It's my fault, my fault." And then the bus door shook with a powerful impact. The impact on the bus door was so strong that the metal bent inwards, leaving a fist-sized dent. The passengers screamed almost simultaneously, their voices mixed into a chaotic hum. The red-haired girl clung to her boyfriend, her nails dug into his arm so that drops of blood appeared. Do something," she screamed, but he just stared at the door, his face as white as chalk. The second blow came almost immediately, and the hinges of the door creaked pitifully, ready to snap off. A woman with a bag was sitting on the floor with her head in her hands. Her hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and blood was flowing from a torn sleeve, not a deep wound, but enough to leave stains on the upholstery. "I knew he would find me," she muttered, her voice trembling, but there was something else in it, not just fear, but a mixture of guilt and doom. An old man with a cane stood at the aisle, leaning on a stick, and looked at the door with frightening calmness. "He won't stop," he said softly, almost to himself. "He never stops." Outside, the sound of metal scraping on asphalt could be heard, the same rod with a hook that the stranger was dragging behind him. Heavy footsteps approached, and his silhouette appeared through the cloudy glass of the door, tall, slightly hunched, with long arms that seemed unnaturally relaxed. The passengers held their breath, but the silence was broken by the scream of a teenager somewhere in the forest, weak, choking, full of pain. He was alive, but clearly not okay. At that moment, the red-haired girl's boyfriend snapped. He grabbed the bag and threw it at the door, as if that would make a difference. "We have to fight. We can't just sit here." "Stop it," he shouted, his voice cracking with tension. But no one moved. The woman with the bag raised her head, her eyes were empty. "You don't understand. This is not a fight. This is payback." Her words hung in the air, and the old man nodded as if in agreement. The third blow tore the door off its hinges. She crashed to the ground with a deafening crash, and cold air rushed into the cabin, mixed with the smell of blood and dampness. The stranger stepped inside. His face was still covered with a dirty cloth, but now it was clear that it was not a mask, but something like a bandage soaked in something dark and sticky. In his right hand he held a rod, and in his left, a bloody piece of cloth that used to be part of the teenager's jacket. He took his time, just stood and looked at the passengers, tilting his head first one way, then the other, as if choosing. The red-haired girl screamed and tried to get under the seat, but her boyfriend grabbed her by the shoulders. "Run. Through the back door." He pushed her towards the emergency exit, but the glass was jammed and the handle wouldn't budge. The girl was pounding on it with her fists, leaving bloody marks from the broken knuckles. The stranger took a step forward, and his shoes left dirty footprints on the floor, mixed with something red. The woman with the bag suddenly jumped up and rushed to him, her arms outstretched. "It's me. Take me away and leave them." But he didn't even look at her. Instead, he raised the rod and struck the old man with the cane with terrifying precision. The metal hook bit into his shoulder, piercing through the bone with a wet crunch. The old man didn't scream, just let out a short groan and collapsed, his cane rolling down the aisle. Blood splattered onto the seats, staining the upholstery with dark stains. The passengers froze. The red-haired girl's boyfriend rushed towards the stranger with his fists, but he threw him back in one motion like a rag doll. The guy hit his head on the metal handrail, and there was a dull crack. The skull broke. Blood flowed down his face, flooding his eyes. The girl screamed so loudly that her voice broke into a rasp, and she fell to her knees next to him, shaking his body. "No, no, wake up." The stranger turned to the woman with the bag. She stepped back, tripped over her bag, and fell. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't my choice," she screamed, but he had already raised the rod. The hook entered her chest, just under her ribs, and she choked on blood, her body twitching a few times before quieting down. Blood was spreading across the floor, mixing with the mud from the killer's boots. The red-haired girl was left alone in the salon. She was crawling backwards, her hands sliding on the sticky floor, and her face was smeared with tears and the guy's blood. The stranger took a step towards her, but stopped when there was a new sound outside, the faint moan of a teenager, still alive. He turned around and got off the bus, leaving the girl alone among the bodies. She sat trembling, listening to the footsteps recede, followed by the crunch of bones and a final scream that ended in silence. A few minutes later, she heard something heavy fall next to the bus. It was a teenager, or his remains. His body was mutilated, his arms were twisted at the joints, his chest was crushed, and his face was turned into a mess. The stranger stood over him, slowly wiping the rod on the cloth on his belt. He wasn't looking at the bus, but she knew he would be back. She jumped up and rushed to the back exit, banging on the glass again. This time it gave way, cracking from the impact. She fell out onto the cold ground and crawled into the woods without looking back. Her breathing was ragged, her legs were clinging to the roots, and only one question was spinning in her head: why? But there was no answer, just the sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness again. Only the dead remained on the bus. The woman with the bag was lying in a pool of her own blood, her eyes were open, but they could no longer see anything. The old man with the cane froze in an unnatural position, his hands still clutching the air where the stick used to be. The red-haired girl's boyfriend was lying by the handrail, his blood dripping onto the seat, dripping onto the floor with a steady sound. And outside, the forest was silent, absorbing the last echoes of horror. The red-haired girl was crawling through the forest, her hands and knees were torn by roots and sharp stones, leaving a thin trail of blood behind her. Her breath came out in short, painful sobs, and her throat hurt from the screams she could no longer make. The trees seemed endless in the dark, their branches clinging to her hair and clothes as if trying to hold her down. She didn't know where she was running to, just away from the bus, from the sound of footsteps, from what was left of her boyfriend and the others. But in the back of her mind, she knew he was still there, and he was coming for her. The footsteps resumed, slow and measured, with the crunch of branches under heavy boots. She froze, pressed against the trunk of a tree, her fingers gripping the bark so hard that her nails broke, leaving bloody streaks. The sound was getting closer, and soon she heard something else low, hoarse breathing, like a man who had held back his rage for too long. She put her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming, but her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed he could hear it through the woods. The stranger appeared from behind the trees, silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. In his hands he held a rod dripping with blood, fresh, dark, mixed with mud. The cloth on his face was pulled to the side, revealing part of his chin, covered with old scars and a dried crust of blood. He stopped a few meters away from her, tilting his head as if he was sniffing. The girl cowered, her body trembled, and tears flowed down her cheeks, mixing with dirt and blood from her broken hands. He took a step forward, and she couldn't stand it. Taking off, she ran, stumbling and falling, but forcing herself to move on. Her legs buckled when she came across the ravine, the one where the driver had been found. The remains of a teenager lay below, his body was torn to pieces, his insides were thrown out, and one arm was torn off and thrown aside. The smell of blood and rot hit her nose, and she fell to her knees, her stomach twisted, but there was nothing left to vomit. The footsteps behind him grew louder. She turned around and saw him descending into the ravine, his movements calm, almost lazy. He wasn't in a hurry, he knew she had nowhere to run. The girl tried to get up, but her foot got stuck in the roots, and she collapsed back, dislocating her ankle with a sharp crunch. Pain shot through her, but a scream stuck in her throat when she saw that he was already there. The stranger stood over her, looking down at her. The cloth on his face finally slid off, revealing his eyes, cloudy, with red veins, but full of cold, inhuman hatred. He didn't say a word, just picked up the rod and ran the hook across her cheek, leaving a deep cut. Blood flowed down her face, flooding her eyes, but she didn't even blink, fear had completely shackled her. He leaned closer, and she could feel his breath, hot, with a metallic taste of blood. Then he grabbed her by the hair and yanked her to her feet. Her sprained ankle buckled, and she screamed in pain, but he only tightened his grip, tearing out strands along with pieces of skin. The rod pressed into her stomach, the cold metal bit into her skin, and she realized that this was the end. The first blow landed in the ribs. The hook pierced through flesh, breaking bones with a wet crack, and she gasped, blood gushing from her mouth. He didn't stop, the second blow tore open her side, turning her insides out. She fell, her body twitching in agony, and he continued to beat her, methodically and mercilessly, until her screams turned into wheezes and then into silence. Blood spilled onto the ground, mixing with the dirt, and her red hair spread across the grass like a fiery spot in the dark. When it was over, he straightened up, wiped the rod on her clothes, and slowly walked back to the bus. There, among the bodies, he stopped and took out a small notebook from his pocket, stained with blood and dirt. He opened it and ran his finger down the list of names, crossing out the last one. Then he dropped the notebook on the floor, next to the body of the woman with the bag, and went outside. In the morning, the bus was found by local hunters. It was quiet inside, except for the flies buzzing over the pools of blood. The bodies lay where they had been left, the driver in the ravine, an old man with a punctured shoulder, a guy with a fractured skull, a woman with a torn chest. The teenager was torn to pieces, and the red-haired girl remained in the forest. Her body was found a few meters from the ravine, mutilated beyond recognition. The notebook was open, the names had been crossed out in rough lines, and next to the last one was a fresh mark made in blood. The hunters called the police, but they found no trace of the stranger. There were only boot prints leading into the woods, and a rusty rod left by the roadside. No one knew who he was or why he did it. But in the notebook, on the last page, there was an old photograph pasted on, the one that fell out of the woman's bag. It showed the driver and a man in military uniform smiling, and she was standing next to him, young and scared, with a bag in her hands. Someone had crossed out her face, leaving only a bloody fingerprint. And the bodies were taken to the morgue. But those who saw the bus said that the smell of blood never got out of the cabin. It soaked into the seats, into the floor, into the air, as a reminder of what happened that night.